In the fall of 2021, a search and rescue helicopter circling the Kiamichi Mountains in Pushmataha County, Oklahoma, picked up a thermal signature that the crew could not reconcile with anything in their experience. They were looking for a 7-year-old boy who had been missing for 31 hours in some of the most remote terrain in the lower 48 states. The helicopter's forward-looking infrared camera was scanning a creek drainage about 4 miles south of Clayton Lake, sweeping the canopy breaks and rocky overhangs where a child might have taken shelter. The crew found the boy. He was alive. He was sitting upright under a sandstone ledge with his knees drawn to his chest, and he appeared to be uninjured. That was the good news. The part that nobody on that helicopter or on the ground team has been able to explain in the years since is what was sitting approximately 40 yards from the boy, partially screened by a stand of shortleaf pine, radiating a heat signature so large that the thermal operator initially identified it as an elk before the shape resolved on the screen, and he realized it was upright, standing on 2 legs. And when the helicopter banked closer, the shape moved. It did not run. It turned, looked up toward the aircraft, and walked into the timber on 2 legs with a gait that covered ground faster than anything that size should have been able to move through that terrain. The thermal operator had 15 years of experience running infrared for law enforcement and emergency operations across southeastern Oklahoma. He had imaged black bears, white-tailed deer, feral hogs, coyotes, and every other warm-blooded animal that lives in those mountains. He told the pilot what he saw, and the pilot told him to keep the camera on the boy and not to say another word about it on the radio, because the channel was being monitored by the family and by the county emergency management office. What the camera recorded that night is the clearest thermal documentation of a dogman in proximity to a human being that I have ever reviewed. And the human being was a child, and the dogman was not hurting him. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. The man who led the ground team that night agreed to talk to us on the condition that we change his name. We will call him Travis. He spent 20 years in the Army, the last 12 as a combat medic attached to infantry units in places he does not discuss in detail. Retired in his mid-40s. Moved to southeastern Oklahoma because his wife had family in the area, and because the land was cheap and the mountains reminded him of terrain he had operated in overseas. He bought a piece of wooded property south of Clayton, built a house, and spent the first year doing nothing but sitting on his porch watching the Kiamichi River Valley change color through the seasons. Travis joined the Pushmataha County Search and Rescue Volunteer Team in 2016. The county needed people who could navigate difficult terrain at night, and Travis could do that better than almost anyone in the region. The county sheriff's office, which coordinates search and rescue in Pushmataha County, had a roster of about 15 volunteers, most of them local ranchers and hunters who knew the mountains from a lifetime of living in them. Travis brought something different. He had done search operations in combat zones. He understood grid patterns, radio discipline, medical triage in remote locations, and how to keep moving through rough country when your body was telling you to stop. Within 2 years, he was running the ground operations for most of the team's callouts. The Kiamichi Mountains are a place most Americans have never heard of, and the people who live there prefer it that way. The range is a subgroup of the Ouachita Mountains, running through LaFleur, Pushmataha, and McCurtain counties in the southeastern corner of Oklahoma, where the state pushes up against the Arkansas border, and the terrain shifts from the flat red dirt prairie that most people associate with Oklahoma into country closer to the Ozarks or the southern Appalachians. The ridgelines run east to west. Pine Mountain and Rich Mountain anchor the northern edge, rising above 2,500 feet. The Kiamichi River cuts through the range from its headwaters near the Arkansas line, flowing southwest past Tuskahoma and Clayton before turning southeast toward the Red River. The Upper Kiamichi River Wilderness, established by Congress in 1988, protects just under 10,000 acres of the most rugged terrain in the drainage, a tangle of steep ridges, narrow valleys, sandstone bluffs, an old-growth hardwood forest that has never been logged because nobody could figure out how to get the timber out without spending more on roads than the wood was worth. Outside the wilderness boundary, the mountains are a patchwork of Ouachita National Forest land, private timber company holdings, and tribal trust land belonging to the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. The timber companies run pine plantations on the lower slopes, loblolly and shortleaf pine planted in rotations that keep the logging trucks moving year-round. But between the plantations and above them, the original forest persists. Dense stands of post oak, blackjack oak, hickory, and sweet gum on the ridgelines, cedar and sycamore choking the creek bottoms, understory so thick in summer that you lose sight of the person walking 10 yards ahead of you. The population of Pushmataha County is around 11,000 people spread across 1,600 square miles. The county seat, Antlers, has about 2,500 residents. Clayton, the nearest town to where the search took place, has fewer than 800. The forest between these small towns is vast and old. Travis learned the Kiamichi Mountains the way he had learned terrain in the service, methodically. He hiked the ridgelines and followed the creek drainages and studied the topographic maps until he could close his eyes and describe the contour of any draw within a 15-mile radius of his house. He learned where the black bears denned in winter, tucked into the sandstone overhangs on the south-facing slopes where the afternoon sun kept the rock warm. He learned where the elk moved in the fall, following the creek corridors from the high timber down to the bottomlands. He learned the sound the forest made when it was healthy and full of life, the layered noise of red-shouldered hawks and pileated woodpeckers and barred owls, and the constant rustle of squirrels, and the drone of insects that runs underneath everything in the Oklahoma woods from April through October. He also learned, over the course of those years, that certain parts of the Kiamichi Mountains did not sound like that. Certain drainages went quiet in ways that did not match any pattern he understood. The silence would come on suddenly, as if someone had turned the volume down. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Just wind in the canopy and your own breathing and the sense that something was occupying the space around you that you could not see. He mentioned it to a few of the other SAR volunteers. Most of them shrugged. One of them, a man who had ranched in the Kiamichi Valley his whole life, looked at Travis for a long time and said there were places in those mountains that the old Choctaw people would not go. He did not elaborate. Travis did not push him on it. On the evening of October 23, 2021, Travis received a call from the Pushmataha County Sheriff's Office. A family camping at a dispersed site near Clayton Lake had reported their 7-year-old son missing. The boy had been playing near the campsite while his parents were setting up for the evening. He wandered into the tree line following what his father described as a game trail that led uphill into the forest. When the parents realized he was gone, they searched the immediate area for an hour before calling the sheriff. By the time Travis received the call, the boy had been missing for approximately 3 hours. The sun had already set. The temperature was dropping through the mid-40s and would reach the low 30s before dawn. The boy was wearing a long-sleeve shirt, jeans, and tennis shoes. No jacket, no flashlight, no water. Travis assembled his ground team, 4 volunteers, all carrying overnight packs because a missing child in the Kiamichi Mountains at night meant you were not coming out until you found him or daylight forced a strategy change. The sheriff's office had already requested helicopter support from the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, which operates helicopters equipped with FLIR thermal cameras. The helicopter was inbound from McAllister, about 90 minutes out. Travis drove to the staging area at Clayton Lake and met with the coordinating deputy. The family was from Tulsa. They camped in the area once or twice a year. The father hunted deer in LaFleur County during rifle season. They were familiar with the mountains, but not intimately. The boy was healthy, active, and had no medical conditions. He was described as adventurous and independent for his age, the kind of kid who wandered away from the group to look at things that caught his attention. He had done it before. He had always come back. This time he did not come back. The terrain north of the campsite rose steeply through mixed pine and hardwood forest toward a ridgeline at about 1,800 feet. Below the ridgeline, a series of draws and feeder creeks cut through the slope, creating a maze of small drainages choked with vegetation. If the boy had followed the game trail uphill, he could have gone in any direction once the trail petered out, and game trails in the Kiamichi Mountains peter out constantly, splitting into deer paths that lead to water or bedding areas, and then vanish entirely in the underbrush. Travis divided his team. 2 volunteers would work the east side of the drainage. Travis and a 4th volunteer, a man we will call Lonnie, would take the west side, climbing the slope on a route that Travis knew from previous searches. Lonnie was a retired paramedic who had spent the better part of 25 years running an ambulance in rural Oklahoma. He was steady, quiet, and did not rattle easily, which is why Travis always wanted him on his team. They carried headlamps, handheld radios, GPS units, first aid kits, space blankets, food, and water. Travis also carried a sidearm, standard for SAR volunteers in bear country. They entered the tree line at 8:45 in the evening. Full dark. The canopy closed over them within 100 yards of the clearing, and the stars disappeared. Travis led with his headlamp on low, scanning the ground for tracks and the underbrush for any sign of a child passing through. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of oak leaves, damp from recent rain. A child's footprint would compress the leaves in a way that was visible if you knew what to look for, but the dampness muffled sound and made it harder to hear a response if the boy was calling for help. They climbed for an hour. The terrain was steep enough in places that they were pulling themselves up by grabbing tree roots and exposed rock. Travis called the boy's name every few minutes. The standard SAR call. Clear voice. Pause. Listen. The forest gave back silence. Travis was not alarmed by the silence initially. A child who has been lost in the woods for hours will often stop responding to calls because he is asleep, exhausted, or frightened to the point where any noise triggers a freeze response rather than a callback. Children who are lost in the forest at night go quiet. That is one of the hardest things about searching for them. What did alarm Travis, about 90 minutes into the search, was the quality of the silence around them. He had been in these mountains at night many times. He knew the nighttime soundscape. Barred owls calling their distinctive "who cooks for you" across the drainages. The rustle of armadillos rooting through leaf litter. Coyotes howling somewhere in the distance. The Kiamichi Mountains at night are full of sound, but the forest around Travis and Lonnie had gone dead. No owls, no coyotes, no rustling, nothing except the wind moving through the canopy above their heads and the sound of their own boots on the wet leaves. Trabtan stopped climbing and turned off his headlamp. Lonnie did the same without being asked. They stood in total darkness on a steep slope, listening. Travis had done this in other environments, in other countries, standing still in darkness and letting his ears do the work his eyes could not. What his ears told him now was that the forest around them was occupied by something that had pushed every other living thing out of the area. The biological silence was absolute. In a healthy eastern hardwood forest in October, even at midnight, you should hear something. An insect. A bird adjusting on its roost. A mouse in the leaves. Hearing nothing meant that something had established a presence in this drainage that every other animal recognized as a reason to be elsewhere. Lonnie leaned close and said, very quietly, that the hair on his arms was standing up. Travis could feel it too. A low-grade charge running through his body that he associated with proximity to danger. The same autonomic response he had experienced in combat when his body detected a threat before his conscious mind could identify it. He turned his headlamp back on and kept climbing. At approximately 10:15, they reached a bench in the slope, a relatively flat area about 30 yards wide where the terrain leveled off before the final push to the ridgeline. A seasonal creek ran along the eastern edge, mostly dry in October but with enough moisture in the rocks to support a growth of ferns and moss. Travis swept his headlamp across the bench and stopped. Tracks. In a patch of damp sand along the creek bed, a series of impressions that he picked up immediately because his headlamp was angled low and the shadows they cast were pronounced. The first set of tracks he identified was the boy's. Small tennis shoe prints, the tread pattern clearly visible, heading north along the creek bed. The impressions were sharp, probably within the last 12 to 18 hours given the moisture content of the sand. The boy had walked along this creek. The stride was short and irregular, suggesting he was tired or picking his way carefully over the rocks. Travis felt the first real surge of hope since the search began. The direction was consistent with a child following water, which is what they do instinctively when they are lost. The second set of tracks stopped Travis cold. They were canid, large canid. The pad impressions showed 4 toes with heavy claw marks, deeply pressed into the sand, with a foot width that Travis estimated at just over 5 inches. He had tracked black bears and coyotes across this terrain for years. He knew what a coyote track looked like in sand. This was 3 times the size of any coyote print he had ever measured. It was larger than any wolf track he had seen in photographs or training materials. And the stride was wrong, over 40 inches between prints, at a walking pace, in a registration pattern that showed separate front and rear impressions rather than the direct registering gait of a canid on all fours. The pattern suggested something walking upright. He photographed the tracks. He did not say anything to Lonnie about what he was seeing. He moved his headlamp along the creek bed and found where the 2 sets of tracks converged. The boy's shoe prints and the large canid prints ran parallel for about 20 yards heading north. The canid tracks were consistently to the left of the boy's tracks, about 6 to 8 feet offset, as if something was walking alongside the child at a fixed distance, pacing him, matching his stride. Travis radioed the east side team to redirect toward his GPS coordinates and relayed to the staging area that he had found the boy's tracks heading north. He did not mention the second set of tracks. The helicopter was still 20 minutes out. Travis and Lonnie kept moving north, following the paired tracks. The tracks led to a sandstone overhang about 300 yards north of where Travis first found them. A shelf of resistant sandstone jutting out from the slope where softer shale had eroded beneath it, creating a shallow cave about 15 feet wide and 6 feet deep. The floor was dry. The back wall was sheltered from wind and rain. Travis saw the boy before the boy saw him. His headlamp caught the reflective strip on the kid's tennis shoes first, a small rectangle of white light bouncing back from the darkness under the ledge. The boy was sitting with his back against the rear wall, knees pulled to his chest. His eyes were open. He was not crying. He looked at Travis's headlamp without flinching, without calling out, without any of the reactions that Travis expected from a child who had been alone in the mountains for over 6 hours in the dark. The boy looked calm. Travis approached slowly, identifying himself. "Search and rescue. We are here to take you home." The boy nodded. He said okay. Travis knelt and did a quick assessment. No visible injuries. No signs of hypothermia beyond mild shivering. His core temperature felt normal through his shirt. His eyes tracked normally. He was coherent, oriented, and responsive, all of which was remarkable for a 7-year-old who had spent the better part of a night alone in the wilderness. Travis asked the boy if he was hurt. The boy said no. Travis gave him a granola bar and a sip of water. Lonnie was already on the radio, reporting that the boy had been found alive and appeared uninjured. The east side team confirmed they were en route. The staging area confirmed the helicopter was now overhead. Then the boy said something that Travis has replayed in his mind every day for the past 4 years. The boy said he was not scared because the big dog kept the other animals away. Travis asked him what he meant. The boy said that when it got dark and he could not find the trail back to the campsite, he crawled under the rock because it was dry. He said he was scared at first because he could hear things in the woods. Coyotes. Something bigger moving through the brush. He said he started to cry. And then the big dog came. He said it was really big, bigger than any dog he had ever seen. He said it walked up to the overhang on 2 legs, which he repeated twice, on 2 legs, and then it sat down outside the opening and stayed there. He said the other sounds stopped after that. The coyotes went quiet. Whatever had been moving through the brush was gone. He said the big dog did not come inside the overhang. It sat outside, between the boy and the forest, facing away from him, like it was watching the tree line. He said at one point he reached out and almost touched it, but he was too scared to actually do it, so he just sat there and watched it, and eventually he fell asleep for a while. He said when he woke up the dog was still there. He said it smelled bad, like a wet dog, but worse, and it made a sound in its chest that he described as like a cat purring, but deeper, much deeper, like the sound was coming from somewhere inside its body, rather than from its mouth. Travis asked the boy what the dog looked like. The boy said it was dark, like black or really dark brown. He said it was bigger than his dad. He said its face was like a dog face, with a long nose and ears that stuck up. He said its eyes were yellow. He said it had hands, not paws, and that the hands had fingers and long nails. He said it looked at him a couple of times during the night and he could tell it was not going to hurt him. He said he just knew. Travis was still processing the boy's account when the helicopter arrived overhead. The rotor wash sent leaves and debris swirling through the trees. The FLIR camera lit up the thermal display in the cockpit, and Travis heard, through his radio, the pilot confirm visual on the ground team and the child. Then, on a secondary frequency that the staging area was not monitoring, the thermal operator said something to the pilot that Travis caught because his radio was scanning both channels. The operator said there was a large thermal signature moving away from their position at approximately 40 yards, heading northwest through the timber, bipedal and fast. Travis looked northwest. His headlamp reached maybe 60 yards into the trees before the light scattered against the trunks and the underbrush absorbed it. He could not see anything, but he heard something. A single vocalization that rose from the forest below and to the left. A sound that he has never been able to adequately describe to me despite 3 separate conversations about it. He said it was low, lower than any animal sound he associated with the Oklahoma woods. He said it had a quality that he felt in his rib cage before he processed it as a sound in his ears. He said it lasted maybe 2 seconds and then cut off sharply, as if whatever made it had said what it needed to say and stopped. Lonnie heard it too. Travis could tell because Lonnie's hand went to his sidearm, a reflexive motion that told Travis everything about how the sound had registered. The boy did not react to the sound at all. He looked in the direction it came from with an expression that Travis described as recognition, like he knew what it was. Travis wrapped the boy in a space blanket, picked him up, and started down the mountain. He did not wait for the east side team. He went straight down the slope through the timber, moving as fast as the terrain and the child's weight would allow. Lonnie stayed close behind him, his hand on his sidearm for the entire descent. Neither of them spoke. They reached the staging area 40 minutes later. The boy was transferred to his parents, who were standing at the edge of the parking area looking like people who had been hollowed out by fear and then suddenly, overwhelmingly refilled. The mother dropped to her knees when she saw him. The father stood very still with his jaw clenched and his eyes wet. An EMT from Antlers checked the boy. Vital signs normal. No injuries. Mild dehydration. A few scratches on his hands consistent with moving through underbrush. The boy was discharged from the hospital in Antlers 2 hours later. Travis sat in his truck in the staging area for a long time after the family left. He was looking at the photographs on his phone, the tracks in the sand. The boy's small shoe prints and the large canid prints walking side by side along the creek bed, heading north, heading toward the overhang where the boy would spend the night under the protection of a creature that should not exist. Lonnie came to the truck before he left. He leaned in the window and said he was not going to put what they heard in his volunteer report. Travis said he understood. Lonnie asked if Travis was going to mention it. Travis said he had not decided yet. Lonnie stood there for a moment. Then he said the sound had reminded him of something he heard once on a call in McCurtain County. A sound coming from the timber off a back road where a car had gone into a ditch in the middle of the night. He said he had never mentioned that one either. He said goodnight and drove home. Travis went back the next morning. He went alone, before dawn, carrying his sidearm and the GPS coordinates of the overhang. He wanted to see the tracks in daylight. He wanted to measure them. He wanted physical evidence that would either confirm or deny what the boy had described, because a 7-year-old's account of a giant dog that walks on 2 legs is not the kind of testimony that holds up under scrutiny from adults who need the world to make sense. The tracks were there. The daylight made them clearer and worse. The canid prints along the creek bed were unambiguous. Travis measured 12 distinct impressions. The largest was 5¼ inches long by 4 3/4 wide. The claw marks extended nearly an inch beyond the toe pads. The stride length averaged 44 inches. Travis had spent enough time tracking predators to know that a stride of 44 inches from a canid at a walking pace would require an animal well in excess of anything in the Oklahoma wildlife catalog. A large male gray wolf might produce a track 4 inches long with a stride of 30 inches. What Travis was looking at was substantially larger and walking in a pattern that did not match any quadruped he had ever tracked. He followed the tracks to the overhang and found what he expected to find and dreaded finding. Around the entrance, the tracks were concentrated. Something had sat or crouched in front of the opening for an extended period, shifting its weight, adjusting its position. The impressions were deep and overlapping, consistent with a large animal settling into a guard posture and staying there for hours. The boy's shoe prints were inside the overhang. The canid prints stayed outside. Whatever had been there, it had respected the boundary of the boy's shelter. It had positioned itself between the child and the open forest. It had done what Travis, in over 2 decades of military service and 5 years of search and rescue, recognized immediately as a protective posture. He found one more thing before he left. At the base of a short-leaf pine about 20 yards northwest of the overhang, on the route the thermal operator had described the large signature taking when it withdrew, Travis found a depression in the leaf litter. A large, heavy body had lain there, pressing the leaves flat in an area roughly 3 feet wide by 6 feet long. A resting position, where whatever had been guarding the boy could see the overhang and the approach to the creek drainage. The musky smell the boy had described was present in the depression, faint but distinct, an organic odor that Travis did not associate with any animal he knew. Travis collected his measurements, his photographs, and his GPS coordinates. He did not take plaster casts. He had not brought casting materials because he had not expected to need them, and by the time he drove home, retrieved a casting kit, and returned, rain was moving in from the southwest. A line of thunderstorms that the Weather Service had been tracking across the Red River Valley hit Pushmataha County around midday and dropped nearly an inch of rain in 2 hours. By early afternoon, the sand along the creek bed was washed clean. The tracks were gone. The depression in the leaves was pooled with water. The physical evidence that had been there at dawn, sharp and unambiguous in the morning light, was erased as thoroughly as if someone had come through with a hose and scrubbed the landscape. Travis stood at the creek bed in the rain, looking at the smooth sand where the prints had been, and felt a sensation he could not name, occupying the space in his chest, where grief and anger would have been if either word had been accurate. He had the photographs. He had the measurements. But the tracks themselves, the physical impressions in the earth that proved something large and real had walked beside a lost child in the dark, those were gone. The rain had done what every other institutional and natural force in this field does to Dogman evidence. It made it disappear. The institutional response was a study in how systems handle information that does not fit their operational framework. Travis filed his volunteer SAR report with the Pushmataha County Sheriff's Office the following day. The report documented the search timeline, the route, the location where the boy was found, his condition, and the handoff to the EMT. There was no field on the form for unidentified large predator tracks found at the subject's location. There was no checkbox for child apparently guarded by unknown bipedal canine during overnight exposure. Travis wrote a factual report that described what could be described within the form's structure and left out everything that could not. He did include one line. In the section for environmental hazards, he wrote large unidentified animal tracks, observed near subject's location. He knew what would happen with that line. It would be read by the deputy who managed the SAR files. The deputy would note it. No follow-up would be ordered because the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation does not conduct surveys based on SAR volunteer reports about unidentified tracks. The line would exist in the file, a placeholder for the truth, technically accurate and functionally invisible. The helicopter crew filed their own report through the Oklahoma Highway Patrol chain. Travis never saw it. He does not know whether the thermal operator included his observation of the large bipedal signature. He suspects not. A thermal operator who writes bipedal, large, moving northwest at high speed in a FLIR report for a child rescue operation is an operator who gets pulled aside by his supervisor for a conversation about equipment calibration and fatigue protocols. The child was found. The child was safe. The mission was a success. Anything that complicates that narrative is noise. The boy's account was relayed to Travis secondhand, about a week after the rescue. The family had been interviewed as part of the standard follow-up. The boy had been consistent. He told his parents the same thing he told Travis under the overhang. The big dog came and kept the other animals away. Dark fur, tall, walked on 2 legs, hands with fingers and long nails, yellow eyes, a deep rumbling sound in its chest. sat outside the overhang facing the forest, did not try to come inside, just stayed there, between him and everything else, until the helicopter came. The parents had taken the boy to a counselor in Tulsa. The counselor evaluated the boy over several sessions and reported that the child was unusually well adjusted for someone who had been through a wilderness ordeal. No nightmares, no fear of the dark. The boy spoke about the experience with a matter-of-factness that was atypical for his age. He was not traumatized. He talked about the big dog the way he talked about the family's pet, with familiarity and affection rather than fear. The counselor attributed this to a coping mechanism, the child's mind constructing a protective figure to manage the terror of being alone in the dark. A psychological explanation that made sense within the counselor's framework and did not require anyone to consider the possibility that the protective figure was real. Travis considered that explanation. He wanted it to be true. A child's imagination populating the darkness with a guardian animal is a well-documented psychological response. It would explain everything, except the tracks. 5¼ inch canid prints in damp sand, running parallel to a child's shoe prints for 20 yards, leading to an overhang where concentrated impressions showed that something large had sat in a guard posture for hours. The depression in the leaves where something heavy had lain down within sight of the child. The smell, the thermal signature recorded by a FLIR operator with 15 years of experience who knew the difference between an elk and something standing on 2 legs. The boy's imagination did not leave tracks in the sand. If you have spent any time in the Kiamichi Mountains, if you have hiked the ridges between Clayton and Big Cedar, or hunted the drainages south of the Talamina Scenic Drive, you know the terrain I am describing. You know how fast it goes from accessible to remote, how quickly the cell service drops and the roads turn to mud and the forest closes in around you. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen out there, because the reports I have been going through from that part of Oklahoma describe a pattern that goes back a lot further than 2021. The Kiamichi Mountains sit in the heart of what was, and in many ways still is, Choctaw country. The Choctaw Nation's relationship with this land dates to the 1830s, when the tribe was forcibly removed from their homeland in Mississippi and Alabama and relocated to Indian Territory along the Trail of Tears. The Choctaw established their seat of government at Tuskahoma, a settlement in the Kiamichi Valley in what is now Pushmataha County. But the human relationship with this landscape goes much deeper. Archaeological surveys in Pushmataha County have identified over 220 sites of ancient habitation, some dating back 8,000 years. The Kiamichi River Valley has been home to human beings for longer than most American cities have existed, and the people who lived there first developed an understanding of what shared the landscape with them. The Choctaw have documented traditions of beings associated with the deep forest that do not fit any Western biological category. Anthropological records from the 19th and early 20th centuries describe several. The Nalusa Falaya, which translates roughly to long black being, is described in recorded Choctaw tradition as a tall, dark figure with small eyes and long pointed ears that inhabits the forest and can frighten hunters or communicate its own power. The anthropologist David Bushnell recorded accounts of the Nalusa Falaya from Choctaw elders in Louisiana in 1910. The Kashehotapalo, a being combining elements of man and deer, appears in the same ethnographic record. The Champ, described as a large, foul-smelling, man-like creature associated with remote forests, appears with enough consistency across sources that multiple ethnographers recorded it independently. These traditions are descriptions of specific beings associated with specific landscapes, passed down through generations of people who had every reason to take what they encountered seriously. The Choctaw, who settled in the Kiamichi Mountains in the 1830s, brought their oral traditions from Mississippi, but they also encountered a landscape that their traditions already had categories for. When Travis contacted a member of the Choctaw Nation's Cultural Resources Office to ask whether traditional stories described beings in the Kiamichi Mountains that matched what the boy had described, the response was measured. The person he spoke with confirmed that the Choctaw oral tradition includes accounts of large beings in the forest that do not correspond to any known animal. The person said these traditions are considered sensitive cultural knowledge and are not widely shared outside the tribal community. The person did not confirm or deny that unusual sightings had been reported on tribal land. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes. It was polite, guarded, and unhelpful in the way that institutional responses are unhelpful when the question falls outside the boundaries of what the institution is willing to address on the record. That careful boundary setting is itself a data point. Linda Godfrey documented the same pattern across the Great Lakes region over 3 decades of researching Dogman encounters. Indigenous communities that have traditions describing beings consistent with Dogman reports do not respond with disbelief. They respond with acknowledgement, followed by a firm boundary. The beings are known, they are part of the traditional understanding of the landscape, and that understanding is not shared with outsiders, for reasons that predate European contact. The Kiamichi Mountains, the winding Stair Mountains to the north, and the forested ridgelines of McCurtain County form a continuous corridor of dense, sparsely populated forest extending from the Oklahoma-Arkansas border south to the Red River. The Ouachita National Forest's Oklahoma sections cover over 300,000 acres. The Honobia Creek and Three Rivers Wildlife Management Areas add another 260,000 acres of private forest with almost no permanent residents. The total roadless or nearly roadless forested area in southeastern Oklahoma exceeds 500,000 acres. That is the kind of territory that can sustain a breeding population of a large predator without the predator ever needing to cross a paved road. Reports from this corridor have been filtering into the Dogman research community for years. Oklahoma does not have the same cultural association with the phenomenon as Michigan or Wisconsin. But the terrain is comparable. The forest density is comparable. The human population density is lower than many classic Dogman regions. And the reports are consistent with every behavioral pattern that Godfrey and other researchers have identified. Nocturnal activity, association with water sources and creek drainages, territorial behavior that emphasizes avoidance over confrontation, awareness of human presence and technology, bipedal locomotion with the ability to drop to all fours for speed, vocalizations that are low frequency and structured, dark fur, canine head with elongated muzzle and erect pointed ears, size ranging from 6 to 8 feet when standing upright. And, in the case of what Travis documented, a behavioral repertoire that includes something no one expected. Protection. That is the detail that separates this account from almost every other Dogman encounter in the research literature. The creature did not stalk the boy. It did not threaten him. It found a lost child in the forest at night, and it sat down between that child and everything else in the darkness, and it stayed there until humans came to take the child home. Then it left. No confrontation with the rescue team. No aggressive display toward the helicopter. A single vocalization as it withdrew, which the boy reacted to with recognition rather than fear, and then it was gone. Travis spent months after the rescue trying to understand what that behavior meant. He read everything he could find. He found Godfrey's books. He found Steve Cook's story about The Legend, the song that started as a radio prank in Traverse City, Michigan in 1987, and then catalyzed decades of genuine reports from people who recognized what the song described. He found the established pattern of Michigan sightings stretching back to the Wexford County lumberjack encounter of 1887. He found the Bray Road beast in Elkhorn, Wisconsin. None of it described what happened in the Kiamichi Mountains. Every encounter in the literature was either neutral or adversarial. None described a Dogman actively protecting a human being. The Dogman recognized the boy as a child. It recognized that the child was alone and vulnerable. It assessed the threats in the environment, and it made a decision. It decided to protect him. That decision required the ability to distinguish between a human adult and a human child. It required the ability to assess a situation and determine that the child was in danger. It required the capacity for what a behavioral scientist would call pro-social behavior, acting on behalf of another individual's welfare. And it required the patience and discipline to maintain a guard posture for hours without engaging with the child beyond its physical presence. Travis is a combat medic who spent 12 years protecting people in dangerous environments. He told me he recognized what the creature did because it was exactly what he would have done. Position yourself between the vulnerable party and the threat vector. Establish a perimeter. Hold your position until relief arrives. The tactics were identical. The species was not. If the Dogman had the cognitive capacity for protective behavior toward a human child, then every assumption about the creature's relationship with humans needed to be reconsidered. The territorial displays documented in other encounters, the aggressive warnings, the camera destruction, the equipment sabotage, all of it takes on a different character when you add the capacity for compassion to the behavioral profile. A creature that can choose to guard a child can also choose to warn a hiker, choose to intimidate a hunter out of its territory rather than attack, choose to disable equipment rather than harm the operator. The restraint that other researchers have documented is not a limitation, it is a choice, and a creature that makes choices of that complexity is operating at a level of intelligence that Western biology has no classification for. Travis's wife knew something had happened during the search. She had seen the change in him before, years ago, when he came back from his last deployment. The hypervigilance, the way he would stand at the window after dark, scanning the tree line at the edge of their property, the insomnia that ran in cycles. She asked him what happened on the mountain. He told her a version of the truth. He said they found the boy, and there was some wildlife activity near the site that he could not identify. She accepted the explanation because she knew from experience that Travis would tell her the full story when he was ready. He told her 6 months later, on a night when they were sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm move across the Kiamichi Valley. He described the tracks, the boy's account, the thermal signature, the vocalization. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question. She asked whether the boy was scared of it. Travis said no. She nodded and said maybe the boy knew something the adults did not. Travis continued with the SAR team after the rescue, but his relationship with the Kiamichi Mountains changed in ways that were visible to the people around him, even when the reasons were not. He still hiked the ridges and worked the drainages. He still ran search operations when the calls came in. But he moved through the forest differently now, with a quality of attention that the other volunteers noticed without being able to name. He paid attention to the silence in ways he had not before. When a drainage went quiet, when the birds stopped and the insects fell off and the forest went still in that particular way that he had learned to recognize, he no longer dismissed it or pushed through. He stopped. He listened. He understood what the silence meant. Something was there. Something that pushed every other living creature out of the area by its simple presence. And he found himself, in those quiet drainages, not afraid exactly, but aware in a way that changed the quality of every step he took. Aware that he was being observed. Aware that something in those trees was making decisions about him, assessing him, allowing him to pass through territory that it could close to him at any time if it chose to. He stopped deer hunting. He had hunted whitetail every November since he moved to Oklahoma, sitting in a stand on his own property or on a friend's lease in LaFleur County, watching the draws at dawn for movement. After the rescue, he did not buy a tag. His wife asked about it. He said he just was not feeling it this year. The next year, he did not buy one either. The truth, which he did not articulate to anyone, including himself, for a long time, was that he could no longer sit in the woods with a rifle and feel the same way about it. The forest had become something different for him. It was no longer a place where he was the most capable thing present. It was a place where another intelligence operated, one that had demonstrated and restraint and a capacity for protection that exceeded anything he associated with wildlife. And carrying a weapon through that kind of place felt less like preparedness and more like presumption. He went back to the overhang twice more in the following months. The first time, in December, he found nothing. The second visit, in March, produced something different. At the base of a post oak, about 30 yards south of the overhang, he found claw marks. 4 deep vertical gouges in the bark, starting at about 5 feet off the ground and extending past the 7-foot mark. The wood was fresh. The sapwood was still wet, where the bark had been torn away. The marks were too high for a black bear, too wide for a bobcat, and arranged in a pattern of 4 parallel grooves spaced roughly 2.5 inches apart. Over the following 2 years, Travis documented 7 more sets of claw marks on trees within a 3-mile radius of the overhang site. They formed a rough perimeter around approximately 4 square miles. The the kind of territorial boundary marking documented by researchers in Michigan and Wisconsin. He found tracks 3 more times. Once in spring of 22, after rain, in the same creek bed. Once in fall of 23, on a muddy logging road 2 miles west. And once in January of 24, in fresh snow on a ridgeline, a single line of bipedal canid prints stretching 60 yards before the snow thinned on exposed rock. The snow prints were the clearest he had ever found. The depth allowed him to estimate the creature's weight at between 300 and 400 pounds. He never saw the creature again. In 3 years of regular visits to the territory he had mapped, Travis never laid eyes on the Dogman. He heard it twice. Once in the fall of 22, a low vocalization rising from a creek bottom at dusk, and once in winter of 23, a series of loud impacts on wood from a ridge about a quarter mile away, evenly spaced, deliberate. He counted 7 before the knocking stopped, but if Travis never saw the creature was aware of him. He found tracks near his truck 3 times over the course of those 3 years. Large canid prints on the forest road where he parked, a wide spot on a logging road about a mile from the nearest paved surface. The first time, in the spring of 22, the tracks were faint, barely visible on the hard-packed gravel, and Travis almost missed them. The second time, in the fall of 23, the prints were clear in a patch of mud near his front tire, canid, bipedal stride. The creature had walked up to his truck, circled the driver's side, and continued down the road. The third time, in the winter of 24, Travis found a single deep print in soft ground directly below his driver's side mirror, as if something had stood beside the truck and looked at its own reflection, or looked at what was inside, or simply stood there, close enough to touch the door handle, because it could. The creature was visiting his vehicle when he was in the forest, investigating it, learning it. The tracker was being tracked. The observation had been mutual the entire time, and the creature had been better at it than Travis. Because it had been on this ground longer, it moved through the terrain faster, it could see in the dark without optics, and it had made the decision early on that Travis was not a threat. And that decision allowed it to study him with a thoroughness that Travis could only approximate in reverse. Travis told one other person besides Lonnie and his wife, a Choctaw man who worked for a timber company in Lafleur County. We will call him Daryl. He had grown up in the Kiamichi Valley. His family had been on this land since the removal. He carried, quietly, a traditional understanding of the landscape that included things the timber company he worked for would never acknowledge. Travis told Daryl about the rescue over coffee at a gas station in Clayton. He described the tracks, the boy's account, the thermal signature. He did not use the word Dogman. Daryl listened the way people listen when they are hearing something they already know, without surprise. When Travis finished, Daryl was quiet for a while. Then he said that what Travis described had a name in the old language, but the name was not something he could share because sharing it carried obligations Travis would not understand. He said the beings had been in these mountains longer than the Choctaw had been here, and the people who were here before the Choctaw, the Caddo, they had known about the beings too. He said the beings were part of the landscape the way the river was part of the landscape. You learned their boundaries and you respected their territory, and in return they left you alone. Or, sometimes, Daryl said, they did more than leave you alone. Travis asked if the beings sometimes helped people. Daryl said there were stories, old accounts in the traditional knowledge of the beings intervening when a person, usually a child or someone who was lost, was in danger in the forest. The intervention was always temporary. They positioned themselves between the vulnerable person and the threat, and stayed until the person was found or the danger passed. Then they withdrew. Daryl said the old people did not find this surprising. The beings were understood as part of the same community of living things that included humans, and within that community, certain obligations existed, including the obligation to protect the vulnerable. Travis asked Daryl why the Choctaw Nation did not share this knowledge publicly. Daryl's answer was simple, and it carried a weight that Travis told me he has thought about many times since. He said they had shared their knowledge before, about the land, about the water, about the plants and the animals, and the relationships between all of them. They shared it during treaty negotiations when the federal government wanted to know what the land was worth. They shared it during removal when they were forced to describe the territory they were being marched away from. They shared it during allotment, when the government broke up tribal lands into individual parcels and opened the surplus to white settlement, and everything the Choctaw had identified as important, the water sources, the timber stands, the hunting grounds, was claimed by settlers who used the tribe's own knowledge to take the best land first. Every time they shared what they knew, it was turned into a tool for taking something from them. The sacred sites they revealed were desecrated or built over. The ecological knowledge they offered was extracted and then credited to Western scientists who published it under their own names. After a few hundred years of that, Darrell said, "You learn to keep your knowledge to yourself." He said it without bitterness. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. It rains in the spring, the river floods in June, and we do not tell outsiders what lives in the mountains. The Dogman in the Kiamichi Mountains does not need the Choctaw Nation to confirm its existence. The tracks are there. The territorial markers are there. The thermal footage was there, captured by a state law enforcement aircraft during a documented search and rescue operation. The evidence is as solid as evidence gets in this field. And none of it matters to any institution, because no institution has a framework for processing it, and building one would require acknowledging that the deep forests of southeastern Oklahoma contain something that every official wildlife survey has missed, something that the Choctaw have known about for generations, something that guarded a lost child through the darkest night of his young life, and then vanished into the timber when the helicopter came. The Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation manages the state's predators. Their focus is black bears, which have a growing population in southeastern Oklahoma, and mountain lions, which the department acknowledges as transient individuals, but not an established population. Their database has no classification for an undocumented large bipedal canid. The incident reporting system used by the Pushmataha County Sheriff's Office has no field for it. The OHP's FLIR program records thermal imagery for law enforcement purposes, and those recordings are maintained according to retention schedules that vary by case type, but there is no protocol for flagging anomalous wildlife signatures. The thermal footage from the night of the rescue exists somewhere in the system. Whether it has been preserved, overwritten, or pulled by someone who recognized what it showed, Travis does not know. He requested a copy and was told that operational recordings from helicopter support missions are classified as law enforcement work product and are not available to civilian volunteers. Travis made the calculation that every credible witness in this field eventually makes. The cost of pursuing the evidence through official channels exceeded the benefit. The Department of Wildlife Conservation does not investigate bipedal canids. The Sheriff's Office does not investigate bipedal canids. The Forest Service does not investigate bipedal canids. Nobody investigates bipedal canids because bipedal canids do not exist within any institutional framework, and creating a new category would require someone with authority to put their name on a document that says maybe they do, and that person would need to explain to their supervisor why they were requesting resources to investigate a creature that every wildlife management textbook in the state says does not exist, and their supervisor would need to explain it to a department director. And the department director would need to explain it to a state legislature that controls the department's funding and would very much like to know why tax dollars were being spent chasing a creature that sounds like a werewolf in the Kiamichi Mountains. The chain of professional consequences is so long and so predictable that the evidence never reaches the first link. It stops with the person who collected it, sitting in a truck on a forest road, looking at photographs on a phone, understanding that the system he spent his career serving has no place for what he found, and no interest in building one. Travis still volunteers with the Pushmataha County SAR team. He still hikes the Kiamichi ridgelines. He still checks the drainages for tracks after rain and the trees for fresh claw marks. He does not carry cameras into the territory. He considered it. He purchased a trail camera and drove to the forest road near the overhang with the intention of mounting it on a tree along the creek drainage. He sat in his truck for 20 minutes looking at the camera, and then drove home with it still in the box. He told me the creature had guarded a child. It had positioned itself between a 7-year-old boy and the dangers of the forest, and it had stayed there all night. Mounting a surveillance camera in its territory felt like repaying that act with betrayal. He checks on the overhang every few months. He does not tell his wife when he goes. He drives out early, parks on the logging road, and hikes in along the creek drainage the same way he did the night of the rescue, though in daylight the terrain is gentler, and the forest is full of the sounds that mean everything is normal, that the drainage is unoccupied, that whatever watches this territory has moved to another part of its range. The sandstone ledge is unchanged. The creek still runs through the drainage below it, carrying snowmelt in spring and drying to a trickle by late summer. The shortleaf pines still screen the approach from the south. Travis stands there sometimes and thinks about the boy. The boy is 12 now. Travis does not know his real name. He does not know whether the boy still talks about the big dog, whether the memory has stayed sharp or faded the way childhood memories do, softening around the edges until the guardian that sat outside the rock in the darkness becomes a story the boy is no longer sure he believes. But Travis believes it. He has the tracks. He has the photographs. He has the territorial markers on 7 trees distributed across 4 square miles of Kiamichi mountain forest. He has Lonnie's corroboration. He has Daryl's quiet confirmation that the beings are known, have always been known, and are understood by the people who have lived with them longest as something more complicated and more ancient than any predator classification can accommodate. The Kiamichi Mountains are still out there, running east to west through the southeastern corner of a state that most people drive through on the interstate without ever turning south into the timber country. Pine Mountain and Rich Mountain still shelter the upper Kiamichi wilderness. The Kiamichi River still cuts through the valley past Tuskahoma, where the old Choctaw Council House stands in the trees. The forest is dense and wet and full of life that announces itself in the daytime with bird calls and squirrel chatter and the crash of deer through underbrush. And in certain drainages, along certain creek beds, where the sand holds tracks and the sandstone ledges offer shelter, the forest goes quiet. The birds stop. The squirrels disappear. The insects fall silent. And if you stand very still and let your ears open the way they were designed to open before electric light and engine noise taught us to stop listening, you might hear something in the timber below you, a low sound, a tone your chest registers before your ears do. A sound that has been part of these mountains for longer than any survey or census or treaty can account for. Travis does not know what the Dogman is. He does not claim to understand its biology, its social organization, its evolutionary history, or its place in the taxonomy of North American fauna. He is a retired combat medic and a volunteer search and rescue team leader, not a zoologist. He knows what he found in the sand along a creek bed in the Kiamichi Mountains on an October night in 2021. He knows what a 7-year-old boy told him, calmly and clearly, about the thing that kept him safe through the darkest hours of his young life. He knows what a thermal camera recorded from a state law enforcement helicopter circling above the ridgeline. He knows the territorial markers on the trees and the tracks beside his truck, and the sound that rose from the forest at dusk, a sound his body recognized before his mind could classify it. And he knows what Daryl told him over coffee at a gas station in Clayton, that the beings had been here longer than anyone, and that they were part of the landscape in ways that the people who mapped it and divided it into parcels and sold the timber off the ridgelines would never understand, because understanding required a relationship with the land that those people had spent 200 years refusing to build. The boy is fine. He grew up healthy and untroubled by what happened in the mountains. His parents still camp in southeastern Oklahoma. They have never returned to the site near Clayton Lake, but they have not stopped going into the Kiamichi country, and Travis takes that as a sign that the family has made its peace with what happened, or at least with the parts of it they are willing to examine. The boy was lost and something found him and kept him safe until the adults arrived. That is the simplest version of the story. It is also the hardest to accept, because accepting it means accepting that the oldest forests on this continent contain something that understands human vulnerability and has the capacity to respond to it with something that looks, from every angle Travis can examine it, like mercy. The forest holds what it holds. It held a child through the night. It held the thing that guarded him. It holds them both still. The memory of the one and the continuing presence of the other, layered into the soil and the sandstone and the root systems that bind the ridgelines together above the creek, where the water runs cold and clear over tracks that were there in the morning and gone by noon.